Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. When my wife and I bought our forever home 6 months ago, we thought we'd found paradise. The house sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees, each home unique with its own character. Our place had everything we wanted. A home office where I could work on my graphic design projects, a cozy living room, and most importantly, a long single-car driveway that gave us privacy from the street. What we didn't bargain for was our next-door neighbor. From the moment we moved in, she made it clear she considered herself the unofficial queen of the block. She'd lived in her pristine house for over 30 years and had very specific ideas about how things should be done. During our first introduction, she looked us up and down with barely concealed judgment and made some comment about how the new generation didn't understand neighborhood traditions. I'm not one for conflict. I believe in being a good neighbor and keeping the peace. So when I noticed her enormous SUV was always parked in a way that made backing out of our driveway a real challenge, I tried to address it politely. The issue was a strip of grass and gravel about 5 feet wide that sat between our driveway and her property. She'd been parking there for years, apparently, often leaving her tires right on the edge of our driveway pavement. Getting our cars out required some serious maneuvering. One morning, I caught her as she was getting her mail and mentioned it casually. I told her it would be great if she could pull her car over just a foot or so to give us a bit more room to back out safely. She barely looked up from her mail, waved dismissively, and told me not to be dramatic. That spot had been the parking for her house for decades, she said, and we'd get used to it. The way she said it made it clear she considered the discussion closed. I let it go. After all, we were new to the neighborhood, and I figured maybe it was just how things worked around here. Besides, we could manage the tight squeeze if we were careful. That decision would come back to haunt me in the worst possible way. It was a Saturday afternoon in late spring. My wife had started a new medication for her chronic migraines earlier that week. We'd been careful to read all the warnings and side effects, but sometimes your body just reacts in ways no one can predict. I was in my office working on a logo design when I heard my wife call my name from the kitchen. Something in her tone made me immediately stop what I was doing. When I found her, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her face flushed and her breathing shallow. She told me she felt strange, like her throat was getting tight. As I watched, red welts started appearing on her arms and neck. Her voice sounded strained when she spoke, and I could hear a wheeze in her breathing that hadn't been there moments before. I'd never seen anaphylactic shock before, but I knew enough to recognize the signs. Her body was having a severe allergic reaction to the new medication. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The dispatcher asked for our address, and I gave it while watching my wife's condition worsen by the second. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and the welts were spreading across her skin. I told the dispatcher we needed paramedics immediately, that my wife was having what looked like a severe allergic reaction. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way and stayed on the line, giving me instructions on how to keep my wife calm and monitor her breathing. Every second felt like an eternity. I searched frantically through our medicine cabinet hoping to find an EpiPen we didn't have, feeling utterly helpless as my wife struggled to breathe. Finally, I heard the sirens approaching. Relief flooded through me as the sound grew louder. I looked out the front window expecting to see the ambulance pulling into our driveway. Instead, my heart sank. The ambulance had stopped at the street. That massive SUV was parked in its usual spot, positioned just perfectly to block the narrow driveway. There was no way the ambulance could squeeze by to get closer to our house. I watched in horror as the paramedics got out and assessed the situation. They'd have to carry all their heavy equipment and a gurney up our long driveway on foot. Every second counted in a situation like this, and we were losing precious time. While one paramedic started jogging toward our house with an emergency bag, I ran next door and pounded on the door. When she opened it with her usual scowl, clearly annoyed by the commotion, I could barely form coherent words. I told her she had to move her car immediately because she was blocking the ambulance. Instead of the shock and immediate action I expected, she crossed her arms and looked at me like I was being unreasonable. She informed me coldly that she was parked on her property and didn't know what all the fuss was about, but I had no right to tell her where to park. Her tone suggested she thought I was making a big deal out of nothing, possibly even manufacturing this emergency to prove a point about the parking situation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Behind me, I could see the paramedics struggling up our driveway with their equipment while my wife was fighting for her life inside our house. The woman was more concerned about her perceived property rights than a medical emergency happening right in front of her. A police officer who had arrived with the ambulance overheard our exchange. He stepped forward and his demeanor changed completely when he heard her insisting this was her land and that we couldn't tell her what to do. The officer told her in no uncertain terms to move her vehicle immediately, or it would be ticketed and towed, and she could face charges for obstructing emergency services. He explained that her property was currently impeding a life-saving operation and she needed to move the car now. The shock on her face was almost comical. She clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone in authority. She reluctantly went to get her keys, muttering about harassment and how unreasonable everyone was being. The delay had cost us at least 3 or 4 critical minutes. The paramedics and police officer both noted the obstruction in their reports. As I learned later, knowingly blocking emergency vehicles can be considered reckless endangerment. The paramedics were able to stabilize my wife, and she was transported to the hospital. The doctor confirmed later that the situation had been extremely time-sensitive and that delays in treatment during anaphylactic shock can have severe consequences. Thankfully, my wife made a full recovery, but the incident left both of us shaken. That night, as I sat in the hospital waiting room, the fear for my wife's life slowly transformed into something else entirely: cold, calculated anger. The woman's words kept echoing in my head about how it was her property and we couldn't tell her what to do. Fine, I thought. Let's talk about property. When we got home the next day, I pulled out our deed and the plot map we'd received when we bought the house. As I suspected, our property line extended a full 5 feet beyond the edge of our driveway. The entire patch of grass and gravel where she parked was 100% our property. To leave no room for argument, I hired a professional surveyor. If we were going to do this, we were going to do it right. The surveyor came out a few days later and placed official stakes marking the exact boundary line. It ran right up against the edge of her flower bed, encompassing the entire parking area she'd been using. I could see her watching from her window as the surveyor worked, and later that day I caught her on my security camera trying to move one of the stakes. She apparently thought better of it and left it alone, but her indignation was obvious. Then I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to build a fence. Not just any fence, but a 6-foot-tall solid wood privacy fence, the maximum height allowed by city ordinance. I was going to maliciously comply with her obsession about property lines by establishing mine permanently and unmistakably. I got the necessary permits from the city and, as required by local law, sent her a certified letter informing her of my intent to build a fence entirely on my property, right on the surveyed line. The letter was professional and courteous, simply notifying her that construction would begin on a specific date. The fence company I hired was professional and efficient. When construction day arrived, I watched from my office window as they began digging post holes directly along the survey line. The new fence line ran just inches from her front walkway and completely eliminated her parking spot. It didn't take long for her to come outside. When she saw what was happening, she absolutely lost it. She screamed at the workers, threatened to sue everyone involved, and called the police. When the officers arrived, I calmly presented my building permit and the official survey report. They looked at the documentation, then at her, and explained that this was a civil matter and that I was acting within my legal rights. They warned her that if she continued harassing the workers, she could be arrested. The fence took 2 days to complete. When it was finished, it looked fantastic from our side, professionally installed with a beautiful natural wood finish. From her side, however, it was a giant wooden wall that she now had to look at every day. She'd lost her convenient parking spot and a significant portion of the visual space she'd thought was hers. Now she was forced to park on the street, which she clearly hated based on the dirty looks she shot our way every morning. The best part was knowing that her own entitled, dangerous behavior had been the direct cause of losing the land she'd falsely claimed for so many years. She'd tried to assert ownership over something that was never hers, and in response, I'd legally and permanently established my own property rights. A few weeks later, my wife and I were enjoying a quiet evening in our backyard. We could faintly hear our neighbor complaining to someone about the monstrous fence that had ruined her property. My wife caught my eye, and we shared a small, satisfied smile. I'd learned a valuable lesson about dealing with entitled people who refuse to be reasonable. Sometimes the best response is to give them exactly what they asked for, according to the letter of the law. She'd wanted to play property rights games, so we played by the rules and won. The irony wasn't lost on me that her blocking of emergency services, an act that could have cost my wife her life, had ultimately resulted in her losing something she'd taken for granted for decades. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but sometimes it comes perfectly. Our driveway is now completely clear and accessible. We have total privacy in our backyard. And most importantly, if we ever need emergency services again, there won't be any entitled neighbors creating dangerous delays. Sometimes standing up for yourself means going to extraordinary lengths, but when someone's behavior puts lives at risk, extraordinary measures become necessary. The fence stands as a permanent reminder that actions have consequences and that property rights are something to be respected, not assumed. As for our neighbor, well, she learned that claiming ownership of something doesn't make it yours, and that sometimes when you refuse to be a decent human being during an emergency, you end up losing more than you ever imagined possible. The whole experience taught me that being a good neighbor doesn't mean being a pushover. It means treating others with respect and expecting the same in return. When that respect isn't reciprocated, especially in life-threatening situations, sometimes you have to draw a line in the sand. In our case, that line happened to be made of 6 feet of solid wood. Update. 6 months later. I thought the fence would be the end of our story, but entitled people never seem to learn their lessons easily. The update to this situation is almost more satisfying than the original events. About 3 months after the fence went up, my neighbor apparently decided she wasn't done fighting. She filed a complaint with the city claiming the fence was installed incorrectly and violated various ordinances. She also tried to dispute the property survey, claiming it was fraudulent. The city sent an inspector out who confirmed the fence was properly permitted and installed exactly on the property line. They told her the complaint was frivolous and warned her about filing false reports. The surveying company also provided additional documentation proving their work was accurate and properly registered with the county. But here's where it gets really good. Remember how she used to park in that spot for decades? Well, it turns out she'd been telling potential buyers and her insurance company that the extra parking space was part of her property value. When she tried to sell her house last month, the buyer's inspection revealed that her supposed parking area was actually our land. The sale fell through when the buyers realized they wouldn't have the parking space they thought they were getting. She had to reduce her asking price by $15,000 and update all her property documentation to reflect the actual boundaries. The real estate agent apparently told her straight up that the fence made it impossible to pretend the land was hers anymore, and any future buyers would immediately see the clear property division. But wait, it gets better. 2 weeks ago, she had her own medical emergency. Her adult son called an ambulance when she fell and couldn't get up. Guess where the ambulance parked? Right in front of our house, because our driveway was the closest clear access point to her front door. The paramedics actually thanked me for the fence because it made it obvious where they could and couldn't park. They were able to get their equipment to her quickly because there was no confusion about property boundaries or parking restrictions. The irony was absolutely perfect. The same fence she'd fought so hard against ended up helping emergency responders reach her more efficiently. She's been noticeably quieter since then. No more complaints about the fence, no more dirty looks when she has to park on the street. I think she finally realized that her original behavior during my wife's emergency was what started this whole chain of events. My wife has been doing great, by the way. She carries an EpiPen now, and we've worked with her doctors to identify all her medication allergies. The incident was scary, but it led to better awareness of her health needs. We've also become friends with several other neighbors who apparently had their own issues with her entitled behavior over the years. Turns out we weren't the only ones who dealt with her assumption that she could use other people's property however she wanted. One neighbor told us she used to trim their hedges without permission because she didn't like how they looked from her window. Another said she'd repeatedly moved their trash cans because they weren't positioned to her standards. The fence seems to have been a wake-up call for the whole neighborhood that property boundaries actually matter. The best part is that our property value actually increased because of the fence and the clear boundary establishment. Our real estate agent friend told us that properties with well-defined boundaries and privacy features are more attractive to buyers. So, in the end, my neighbor's selfishness during a life-threatening emergency cost her a parking spot, thousands of dollars in property value, and the false sense of ownership she'd maintained for decades. Meanwhile, we gained privacy, clear property rights, and peace of mind. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it comes, it's absolutely perfect. The fence is still standing strong, by the way. Every morning when I look out my office window, I'm reminded that standing up for yourself and your family is always worth it, especially when someone's entitled behavior puts lives at risk. And if any other neighbors ever think about blocking emergency vehicles or claiming ownership of land that isn't theirs, well, they can look at that fence and think twice. The whole experience also changed how I approach conflict resolution. Before this incident, I was always the type to avoid confrontation and try to keep the peace at any cost. I thought being a good neighbor meant accepting unreasonable behavior and finding ways to work around other people's selfishness. That nearly cost my wife her life. Now I understand there's a difference between being accommodating and being a doormat. When someone's behavior creates genuine safety hazards or legal issues, addressing it directly isn't being difficult, it's being responsible. The fence has become something of a neighborhood landmark. New residents often ask about it when they're walking by, and I've had several conversations with people who are dealing with their own boundary disputes. I always tell them the same thing: document everything, know your property lines, and don't let entitled people convince you that their convenience is more important than your rights. One particularly interesting development happened about 4 months after the fence went up. A couple who lived 3 houses down came to thank me for what I'd done. Apparently, my neighbor had been pressuring them for years to let her use part of their backyard for her garden expansion, claiming it would benefit the whole neighborhood. They'd been too polite to say no directly, but seeing how I'd handled the property line issue gave them the courage to tell her no. They said the fence made it clear that property boundaries mattered and that owners had the right to control their own land. It's amazing how one person's entitled behavior can affect an entire community, and how standing up to it can empower others to do the same. The legal aspect of the story also had some interesting developments. The police report from the ambulance incident became part of a larger discussion in our city council about emergency vehicle access. They ended up passing an ordinance that specifically addresses obstructing emergency services, with much stricter penalties than before. The fire chief actually contacted me to use our situation as a case study in emergency response training. He said it was a perfect example of how civilian interference can create life-threatening delays, and how important it is for first responders to document such incidents properly. My wife has become something of an advocate for emergency preparedness since her recovery. She's joined a local community safety group and helps educate people about recognizing allergic reactions and the importance of having EpiPens available. She always tells people that every second counts in medical emergencies, and anything that delays treatment can be the difference between life and death. The fence itself has held up beautifully. We chose high-quality cedar that's aged to a lovely silver-gray color. We've added some climbing roses along our side, which has created a beautiful natural barrier that gives us even more privacy. From our perspective, it's like having our own private oasis. From her side, well, it's still just a 6-foot wooden wall that reminds her daily of the consequences of her actions. The surveyor we hired has actually referred several other clients to us when they needed recommendations for handling property disputes. Apparently, our situation has become something of a success story in their industry, a case where proper documentation and professional surveying resolved a conflict definitively. We've also learned that our neighbor's behavior wasn't unique. The surveying company told us they deal with similar situations regularly, where long-term informal arrangements lead people to believe they have rights to property they don't actually own. They said most people back down when presented with official survey results, but occasionally you get someone who doubles down like our neighbor did. The insurance implications of the original incident were also more significant than we initially realized. When my wife's medical team reviewed what happened, they determined that the delay in treatment could have been considered a contributing factor if her condition had worsened. Our insurance company was very interested in the police report and the documentation of the obstruction. They ended up pursuing some kind of claim against our neighbor's homeowner's insurance, though we weren't directly involved in those proceedings. We heard through the grapevine that her insurance premiums went up significantly as a result. The psychological impact of the whole situation took longer to process than I expected. For months after the incident, I found myself checking our driveway obsessively whenever I heard sirens in the distance. My wife admitted she'd developed some anxiety about taking new medications, even with proper medical supervision. We ended up doing some counseling to work through the trauma of the emergency and the stress of the conflict that followed. Our therapist said it was completely normal to feel angry and hypervigilant after someone's selfish behavior threatened our safety. She also said that taking action to prevent future problems, like building the fence, was a healthy way to regain a sense of control. The relationship with our other neighbors has strengthened considerably since all this happened. People who might have just waved politely before now stop to chat when they see us outside. There's a sense of shared relief that someone finally stood up to behavior that had been affecting everyone. We've been invited to more neighborhood gatherings and have developed genuine friendships with several families. It's ironic that our neighbors' attempt to assert dominance over the area actually brought the rest of the community closer together. The house sale situation provided the most dramatic conclusion to our story. When the first sale fell through because of the parking issue, our neighbor tried to sue the surveying company, claiming their measurements were wrong. The company's lawyer responded with such comprehensive documentation that she dropped the lawsuit within a week. She then tried to claim that we had somehow damaged her property value through illegal construction. Our lawyer, yes, we had to get one by this point, sent her a letter explaining that building a fence on your own property is completely legal, and that any impact on neighboring property values was the result of her own false claims about land ownership. The second time she tried to sell, she was upfront about the actual property boundaries from the beginning. Even so, she had to drop the price another $8,000 because buyers could see how cramped her actual usable space was without the borrowed land. When the house finally sold, the new owners introduced themselves and mentioned they'd heard about the property line dispute from the real estate agent. They said they appreciated that we'd established clear boundaries because it prevented any future confusion. The new neighbors are wonderful, a young family with 2 small children who actually thanked us for the fence because it gives their kids a safe, defined space to play. They've never once suggested they should be able to use any part of our property, and we've developed a friendly relationship based on mutual respect. Our original neighbor moved to a condo across town, apparently deciding she was done with property maintenance and neighbor relations. We heard she chose a place specifically because it has assigned parking spaces with clearly marked lines. Sometimes I wonder if she ever reflects on how differently things could have gone if she'd just moved her car that day instead of digging in her heels about property rights she didn't actually have. A simple act of human decency during a medical emergency could have preserved a neighborly relationship and saved her thousands of dollars. But entitled people rarely think that way. In their minds, they're always the victim of other people's unreasonableness, never the cause of their own problems. The fence stands as a permanent reminder of several important lessons. Know your property lines, document everything, don't let entitled behavior go unchallenged when it affects safety, and always remember that actions have consequences. Most importantly, it reminds me every day that protecting your family sometimes requires taking a firm stand, even when it's uncomfortable. The peace of mind we have now, knowing our property rights are clearly established and our driveway is always accessible for emergencies, is worth every penny we spent on that fence. And every time I see those cedar boards weathering beautifully in the sun, I'm reminded that sometimes the best response to unreasonable people is simply to follow the law exactly as it's written. Malicious compliance, they call it, but I prefer to think of it as malicious justice. The next one is a pro-revenge story. When I was a tiny kid, my father was my best friend. He worked multiple jobs to support my family, all while powering his way through law school. He even built a couple of small businesses from the ground up with a couple of his friends. All while doing this, he managed to be the best dad ever, spending as much time as he could with my mother, myself, and my baby siblings. One day we found out that he had stage 4 stomach cancer, the kind that you don't recover from. My mother and I stayed by his side all the way till it was all over. The last memory I have of my father was when he was completely immobile, practically a vegetable at this point, with tubes going in and out of his body, and me just praying that he'd still be able to remember who I was. All the guy could do was smile at me just to let me know he still recognized his son, even if the doctors told us most of his memories would be gone. Eventually, he fell into a coma for some days before waking up to say goodbye to my mother, who was by his side when he died. She was a housewife, so we really didn't have much to go on after his death. Enter my grandfather. He was one of those self-centered boomer types who makes everything about himself. After my father died, he'd use the newspaper obituary to boast about his dead son's grades and achievements, which I realized seemed to be the only thing my dad was to him. Just in case you were wondering, yes, we are Asian. My mother was grieving and trying to find a way to make ends meet, and my grandfather graciously offered to help her control my father's 2 businesses to help support us. My mother agreed because she didn't have any experience. While we grew up, the 2 businesses didn't provide much for us, likely because my father was one of the big reasons they were thriving. Mom was in and out of multiple jobs just to keep us floating. My grandfather offered to help put me and my siblings through school. I managed to score some scholarships with some good schools growing up, so thankfully he didn't have to do as much for me. But we were really glad that he helped out with my siblings. After I made it out of school, I found out that my family was broke and my 2 siblings were still making their way through medical school. My sister even offered to stop and just get a job, but I told her to keep going because she was doing so well and that she deserved to graduate. My grandparents had cut us off because they didn't approve of the directions my siblings took in life, especially my sister, who was, for them, too female to have a career in medicine. My grandmother is a bit of a misogynist. Why are you wasting your time and money becoming a doctor? You're just going to have children and quit. I was working as a high school teacher when I was contacted by one of my dad's old business partners for one of his companies. After I asked him about how the company was doing, he told me that my grandfather, who was still in control of my father's shares, was siphoning money from the company for himself, and he was earning way more than he was giving me and my siblings for our education. So, all our lives he'd been making us feel indebted to him for money that was supposed to be ours to begin with, and he lied to us by telling us that Dad's companies weren't making any money for us at all. We also realized that when he cut us off, he was cutting us off from our own money, forcing my siblings to drop out and give up careers that they'd been working their whole lives for. What's worse is that this was our father's money, and we know that he'd wanted it to help us provide for our futures even after he died, and here comes his a-hole father basically crapping on his legacy for his own enrichment. I even found out that he used his position to take possession of the company's office space and forced them to set up shop in a smaller, cheaper office while renting the original space out under his own name to the company's competitors to make money from them too, all while I had to work multiple jobs to help my mother and siblings pay the bills. Cue revenge. My grandfather's biggest weakness has always been his pride. In fact, I suspect that he wanted us to think he was helping support us out of his own pocket because he wanted everyone to think he was some kind of hero, when in reality he was financially choking us. I recognize that no matter what my grandfather said, my siblings, my mother, and I were legally the owners of my father's company shares. So after having a statement signed by the three of them, I approached all the board of directors sans my grandfather and let them know that I was now that sole representative of my late dad's estate. My grandfather also made himself chairman of the board. According to the company records, he did no work for the company at all, so the position was just a name that allowed him to receive money. So I convinced them that since he was only chairman as representative of my father's estate, that made me the chairman. I did not intend to keep the position because I did not have the experience for it. Then I contacted other members of my extended family about my grandfather's unethical practices with the company's office space. He was eventually pressured by them into evicting the company's main competitor from their office space. Serves them right for conniving with my grandfather to take the company's old office space. At the next board meeting, I prepared for the moment I'd been waiting my entire life for. When he entered the conference room to preside over the meeting as the chairman, he found his chair facing away from the table with all the board members already seated at the table. And like a Bond villain, I spun the chair around to reveal to him that I'd been the one sitting there the entire meeting. I told him that the company and my family no longer needed him and that I'd be taking control over representation of my father's estate. "Do you know that I'm the one who put him and his siblings through school?" he said in shock. I only went, "No, Dad did. Dad." The look of sheer embarrassment on his face was perfect. I've never seen him look defeated my entire life until that moment, and this sort of satisfaction could not be achieved by simply ratting him out. I stepped down from the chairman position and took a job in the company's treasury department as a bookkeeper with a meager salary, but at least now any profit sharing or dividends that the company released would go where my father wanted it to go. And finally, one of the first decisions I got to make as a board member before stepping down was to give my mother a permanent job that she deserved. My grandfather is now jobless. He spends all his time at home, and because he spent his life being selfish and self-centered, he has no friends. All he had going for him was being able to power trip over other people and boasting about his assets and achievements. Even my grandmother has had it with him, and the two don't even sleep in the same room anymore. I hope he lives the rest of his short life regretting that he didn't live his life with more compassion and humility. Edit. I've gotten a lot of comments about the legality of what went on. During all this, the only lawyer working in the company was my grandfather, and we all know he did jack crap. When we hired a team of actual helpful lawyers, they told us exactly the same things you guys pointed out. They're still trying to clean everything up so we don't get into big trouble. Update. Apparently my sister saw this post and just informed me that he's kinda miserable now because his wife is angry at him because he siphoned what's left of their money to an extramarital sugar baby he had in probably another attempt at getting someone to affirm and glorify him. I guess he hasn't learned. The next one is a malicious compliance story. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss how we were going to recover from a major problem on the manufacturing line that had reduced production throughput to about 50%. I was not on the production team. I was there to stay informed as the design engineering lead for the project. The problem was software in certain older assembly units and half of the production lines. The best estimate projection from the manufacturing director was that patch, test, and functional confirmation of these units would take a week to 10 days. I suggested that we should contact the manufacturer of the newer functioning units and find out how quickly they could deliver and install replacements for every problem assembler on the lines. Yes, I know, it was a very expensive suggestion. The VP running the meeting simply told me to stay in your lane. You don't know anything about the real work done around here. Having worked elsewhere for nearly a decade in manufacturing prior to transitioning to design engineering and the role at this company, I actually knew all about the real work being done. I also knew that the projection of about 7 to 10 days for a firmware fix for those machines was nothing more than a very deep pile of male bovine excrement. By my rough calculations, it would take at least 3 weeks to complete unit replacement and get the throughput rate back up to a marginally acceptable level. I stayed in my lane. I kept my lips zipped for the remainder of the meeting. I told my director afterwards that the production team had it under control and that I was no longer needed. Following an email discussion thread CC'd to everyone at the meeting, and my director that included my ridiculous suggestion and my humble acknowledgement that I really should stay in my lane, I moved on to a new project. 3 weeks later, after multiple failed attempts to update the old assemblers, the work to replace them all with new units began. 3 weeks after that, production was hovering at about 75% and finally reached 95% after an additional 2 weeks. Grapevine, heard, but no way to substantiate. The manufacturing director was the scapegoat and was let go. The VP's yearly bonus was impacted due to a $450,000 shortfall in revenue. I continued to stay zip-lipped during all production meetings, discussions, email threads, etc. until I left the company a year later. I stayed in my lane. Anyway, thank you for watching.